Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. Welcome to the virtual launch event for Star Wars Ronin, a novel inspired by the Duel from Star Wars Visions. I'm Tom Hoeler. I'm an editor at Rey Books. I work on Star Wars and a number of other things. And tonight I get to be joined by two of my favorite beings in the entire galaxy. We are going to hang out and talk all about this novel, how it came to life, how it was inspired by the Star Wars Visions animated anthology, and what you can expect when the book comes out tomorrow. In fact, just a few hours from right now, unless you're watching this in the future, in which case the book is out. Enjoy. I'm joined tonight by the author of Ronin, Emma Mieko Candon, as well as Matt Martin from the Lucasfilm Story Group. Welcome, Matt. Welcome, Emma. How's everyone doing?
Good.
Happy to be here.
Awesome. So we're going to jump in just a second. But before we do, I want to make two very quick announcements. First, big thanks to our friends at Nerdist and our friends at Mysterious Galaxy for helping us put on this awesome event. If you'd actually like to get a signed copy of Ronin, you can check the link in the description below this video, and there should be a link that gives you all the information about how to get your own signed copy of Ronin by Emma. Second, while we're not going to obviously spoil the entirety of Ronin, we are going to talk openly about a few things. First of all, of course, is The Duel, the animated short that came out just a few weeks ago. We're going to talk about that. We are also going to talk about the early portion of the novel, the first 5 chapters or so, which we released as an excerpt about a week and a half ago. But beyond that, there'll be plenty for you to discover when the book comes out. And trust me, if I sat here and told you everything that's going to happen, you might not even believe me. But it's that good. So let's get started. And I feel like the best place to start is at the beginning with the first time that both of you read the script for The Duel. Obviously, it was at sort of different times in the development of the program. First time you read the script for The Duel, and then got to see the early animation and eventually the final animation for The Duel. What grabbed you? What stuck out to you about this story and about this animated short?
I guess I can start.
Matt, do you want to go first?
Yeah.
You saw it first.
Yeah, that's true. So yeah, I worked on the whole Visions animation project, but I wasn't in on like the super early talks with the studios. So I think the first version that I saw was actually like the very first pitch or outline, and I was just kind of immediately obsessed with this story. It's got such a clear like Jidegeki Kurosawa feel to it, and that's just a genre that I love so much. So it was kind of like I was just instantly taken, and it was so cool seeing things kind of come full circle with like we have these great samurai films that came out in Japan, and then those films had a huge influence on George, and then Star Wars comes out and you can see those influences in the film. And then like decades later, now we have Visions come along and we see Star Wars kind of influencing the classic samurai story. So it's just like, it was so cool to see that whole thing, come to pass.
Emma, what about you?
I shared an absolute instant adoration for sort of the iterative beauty of it. And I feel like I've talked about this a lot now. So if you've heard this in another podcast, I'm sorry. But it's just so cool the way that there's this dialogue between these narrative traditions that are now so deeply, inextricably intertwined in all these very like subtle and referential ways. And this one was very bold and declarative, like, no, we're bashing it together again. And that's very exciting. But like, I think the first thing that drew me into it, that got me really excited, was just the idea of how much interpretation there was going to be involved in juggling between these two narrative traditions, because Jidaigeki has its own like anxieties and Star Wars has separate ones, but they were in direct conversation with each other here. So everything was just, it brought up so many questions in my mind. Like I was just looking at my notes, like what were the first things I wrote about Ronin to myself? And one of the first things is like, okay, a lone swordsman needs a creed. Does this guy have one? And I just had to start digging from there.
Yeah, that was what struck me the first time that I read it and then saw an early animation where like, and Emma, this is the animation you saw, which was like, it wasn't even completely finished. It was, a lot of like kind of initial blocking and things like that. Was the level of restraint in the storytelling because of how little dialogue there was, how everything was relying so much on the visuals, but how every single choice in that story was asking a million questions in the background about what is going on in this world with this character in this town. Why do things look like this? Why is stuff built like that? And that really segue into a thing that I wanted to sort of lay out for folks who've watched the Duel and watched all of Visions, which is to talk about how we chose the Duel, and exactly how we chose to start our, to pick that one to do a book about, because obviously there's no bad choices among all of the animated shorts. They are all phenomenal, and all of them you look at and are like, oh my gosh, there's so much amazing storytelling you could do going forward, coming out of them as prequels from the side, so many characters, like there's no bad choices. So Matt, this is, I guess, more of a question for you since you were there with me at the beginning of this, but what was it about the Duel in particular that made it kind of ultimately the best choice that we decided on to do a novel about?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I remember that initial meeting that we had with your team where we kind of walked you through the deck of all of the different stories that were part of this with just super early art and like log lines and very little information. And it seemed like everybody in the room just naturally gravitated toward the Duel as something that would have that kind of extension to it. And I think it's just that, that kind of classic samurai cinema concept of the wandering Ronin. It just felt really ripe for expansion. Those films have such a historical setting that clearly makes like an interesting world that already, when you mix it with Star Wars, it's going to be cool with the Empire and their lords and the Jedi warriors and so far and so on. But I think what was really key to making it work was really like finding an author who had, a clear understanding of the real history of Japan as well as the world of Star Wars. Like somebody that could actually marry those concepts together. And I think, Emma's probably the only person I can think of who could have managed that.
I think you're probably right. And you're also right about, I think what brought us to the Duel was just those visuals. And I mean, the visuals that we saw at the beginning was just those kind of initial, concept pieces of the Ronin and, Hat Droid B5, his faithful companion, the best character ever in the history of anything. And it's just them standing there. And it was so captivating. And then we got to read the story. What actually jumped out to me that we sort of doubled back to that initial impression. We're like, yep, we knew it. Because obviously we saw the visuals, we heard the log lines, we wanted to read through the script. And it was this funny thing where, like, for everyone else in this story, the Duel is kind of a really important moment for people. It's an important moment for everyone in that town. It's an important moment for the bandits, for the bandit who we meet, for those bounty hunters turns guards, except for the Ronin. The Ronin seems to kind of not care, or seems to be like, this is just Tuesday for me. And it asked such a ridiculous question of like, why is this moment so boring to this guy? What is his life like? What's his history like? What's his future like? That this moment is boring to him. And it asked this question that just demanded an answer of what happens next. And what happened next was, as you said, Matt, we had to go out and find an author who could bring together this story with a sense of the real history of the storytelling traditions that were inspiring it. Emma, which led me to you. We had a couple of early conversations, and it was very clear from the start that you were not just the right person for this book. I think you were the only person who could write this book and do it justice. So when we first pitched to you, hey, would you like to come do a Star War? And you first kind of heard the idea for Visions overall. What did you think? What was the first thing that went through your mind? Because this is even before you had read or seen anything from Ronin.
I mean, it was the very notion of the project that you weren't just doing something in canon, but you were doing something where you're like trying to pull Star Wars as a narrative into direct conversation with its roots. It was almost like impossibly beautiful to me, and the kinds of things that I'm interested in, because I've always been a giant little meta nerd. Like I love talking about the ways in which mythology builds upon itself, because it's constantly changing with people and the stories they tell cross-culturally or within a culture, and just there was something so transcendental about the idea of here is a project that George Lucas created because he saw something in these Kurosawa movies that really spoke to him, and he made this thing, and it blew up. It got huge to the point that like I, as a child, was transfixed by them, and that probably shaped a lot of things about me as a storyteller today. And I was being asked to like come on as a Japanese person, but like a Japanese American, and my history is also really bound up in that back and forth between cultures and like the weirdness of it and like the beauty of it, but also like the pains and the traumas of it. And being asked to like come onto this project and build something out of it was just so immediately exciting in a way I couldn't synthesize directly. It took me days of just having sudden moments of, oh my God, this is really cool.
Well, I'm glad you felt that way because it clearly came out eventually in what became the final story. But I think your first challenge, and this was one of the first conversations I can remember having with you about this, which was that the sort of setup for this is we very much wanted a what comes next story. You know, we wanted a, you know, the Ronin and his droid go wandering off down the road to whatever comes next. So how did you figure out what comes next? Like, what was your process for digging into, okay, I'm writing the sequel, you know, the continuing adventures of the Ronin here. What was your process for kind of tackling how to build that out?
So the way I tend to do it, or like the way I did it here, was I asked, all right, who is this guy? And so it wasn't so much like what comes next as like, where is he coming from? And what about this makes it a moment of change, right? Because you were saying it's just Tuesday. But if it's the inciting event of a book, it has to have like that building block. There has to be something in it that makes this is the point of change. This is where things start to get a little weird, where he can't remain in Tuesday. He has to go to Wednesday. Maybe Wednesday is actually kind of scary. But a lot of that involved digging into Jidaigeki as a genre. And when I was doing that, I wasn't just looking at the history that Jidaigeki is generally interested in, which is sort of the shogunate and then, or like Imperial Japan, with the samurai as characters who exist in the world, but the era in which these movies were being made, which was not solely in post-war Japan, but I was most familiar with post-war Japan, and Kurosawa was working in post-war Japan. And that's the era that I have the most familiarity with. And it's also an era which I've like thought about a lot and like done some of my own research on, because there was a point at which I was digging into the narrativization of racial history in Hawaii. And there's some interesting parallels between the way that local Japanese talked about World War II and the time after it, and the way it's talked about and narrativized in art over in Japan. Because, you know, there's a lot of deep traumas that are being processed in Jidaigeki, I think. And as a consequence, Jidaigeki tend to be extremely sociopolitically complicated. And that was something that like I immediately knew was going to be present in Ronin, and was also immediately going to have some interesting conversations with Star Wars, because on its face, I think we think a lot about like these really, dark, light, black, white morality structures. But something that I've really enjoyed with Star Wars over the years is it's like that's always in the background, but people are still trying to do politics at the same time. And there's this inevitable crisis of like, okay, we do have to do politics, but the dark side is coming. We have to do something about it. And that got a little messed with and like complicated in the kind of story that Ronin became, because it became very married to that complicated nature of Jidaigeki, where they're like, we don't like heroes. We like everybody to have a problem. And to like, be pursuing things that they think are good, but like maybe be willing to do things in the name of that other people would be like, that's no good. You shouldn't do that. So yeah, that was a lot of how to build Ronin came out of looking at that genre and the kind of stories that it tells.
Yeah, and we also benefited from getting from some real generosity on the part of the studio, who gave us some sort of extra background into what exactly, the underpinnings of what the Ronin is doing in the duel, and a little bit of why he's doing it. The studio was really helpful to us, and maybe Matt, you can expand slightly on explaining like a little bit of like why there are all these red crystals that he happens to have in his jacket, and that really helped kind of give. I think Emma, it helped give your story a sense of an initial focus and direction to build out of, while you were also pulling in all of these influences and like synthesizing them into what still has to be a Star Wars story at the end of it.
I don't think I want to go too deep into that.
No,
but I do think it's great that they were so supportive of this. And honestly, I don't know if we've ever heard if any of them have read it yet, but I would love to know the studio's take, because I feel like this was so lovingly crafted, as like clearly from the point of view of somebody who loved their short. And I would just love to see if it's kind of reciprocated.
I hope so.
I'm gonna write myself a note to check on that.
Yeah, I hope so. And this is something that I think as we go along this evening, we're going to come back to again and again. But every single time we made a story decision, and there is one story decision we are going to talk about a little bit later, we constantly went back to the sacred Jedi text, or I guess sacred Sith text in this case, meaning the duel, to look at both the script and look at the animation and say, well, what does the script of the animation tell us about whether or not this is a natural and correct decision for like how the story would progress. We just kept going back to it again and again. And even though that script is not very long, because, our Ronin hero is not a very verbose character, there was just so much in there in the detail of the world, which was great. Emma, you mentioned something or something about this sort of attacking it from the beginning, is that the Ronin is not a verbose character. He does not talk a lot. He does not share his thoughts all that often. Did you find that to be a challenge or an opportunity? The fact that you knew your main protagonist was going to be someone who is not, just spouting off speeches and, giving these grand like ballads and soliloquies every other page. What did you think about having to approach, a central character with that sort of demeanor?
So it's interesting because I actually really like a talkative character. I think that's probably apparent in some of the other characters I put into the cast, but I also really benefit out of characters interacting with things or people. It's very hard for me to just write someone doing introspection. So you actually had some brilliant suggestions right when I turned in the outline about ways I could dig into his internal dialogue and show you what's going on with him inside. And another thing that I borrowed from the original script by Mitsuyasu Sakai, which deviates from the original draft of the duel we saw. He's actually more taciturn in the animation than he is in that original script. And in that original script, he has what I like to call the Star Wars sass. He's just, and I was looking at my notes too about because I read that and I took notes on it about what can this tell me about this character? Who is he? What am I learning about him from this? And there are a couple lines from that original script that made it into the book, because the thing that I love about that character as he was originally envisioned is he has a very wry sense of humor. And having that mechanic that you and the other editors suggested, Tom, that gives us a little more sense of what he's thinking and his internal voice. It was just such a great way to really start digging into that man underlying those walls upon walls that he's trying to put between himself and people. But another thing that I took away from the first section of the animation is he's interacting with the tea shop owner in a very normal way. The guy is a Sith, but he can talk to people. And so that was just something I tried to keep in mind. He does have a lot of these walls. He does not want to tell you about where he's been and what he's done. But he is probably going to chat with somebody if they talk to him.
Yeah, it's just about unlocking the actual conversational topics that he cares about, I suppose.
Yeah.
And I think you put this really neat detail early on that like he as a character has a predilection towards technology, towards like mechanics, towards like fixing droids and like tinkering with things. And I think that you then give him like that's such like an interesting extra dimension to give him, which gives him a kind of outlet to be able to relate to people, to be able to interact with folks like the tea shop owner and folks we will meet later in a way that's not strictly just like about, the swords he may or may not be wearing on his sash. I want to go back just ever so slightly to talk a little bit more, Emma, about the storytelling traditions that you were, and specific stories that you were sort of tapping into as you went to develop Ronin, that you started to talk about. Are there specific Kurosawa films that you went back and, took a look at or revisited, or are there specific other sort of storytelling traditions from Japan that you, in the course of sifting through how you wanted to attack Ronin and approach it, attacking Ronin's actually a bad idea. Don't do that. That you were like, these are the ones that I want to maybe draw from the most, or that you felt like had elements which would be most helpful in developing the story?
So there were two things come to mind. One is that I was really digging into Japanese folklore because that seemed like a good lens through which to translate like the mysticism of Star Wars, which is, that's the star part of the Star Wars. The Jidaigeki and stuff kind of has the war stuff covered. But so I was thinking a lot about, I have this whole list of folklore stuff that I thought it would be cool to put in it. A lot of it didn't make it in. I was like, can you do anything with Oni? What about Benkei? Benkei would be amazing. But the other thing that I was thinking about was Kisho Tenketsu, which people might have heard about. It's the Japanese word for an East Asian style of storytelling, which is more like 4 acts than 3 acts. And, Star Wars is very much like in the Hollywood tradition of the 3 acts. And I think you can debate for days about how much any story actually fits that mold and how much of it is us analyzing it until it fits in that. But I found that I personally naturally kind of think in 4 steps about stories. So I was thinking about Kisho Tenketsu when I created this one, because it's about like 3 acts of sort of setting up the premise and like getting you deeper and deeper into it and showing you all these like dimensions to it. And then the 4th act, there's a twist and it changes everything you understood about everything that came before it. And at the end of this book, and like the early feedback I'm hearing, I'm like, oh, I think I kind of did it. So
Yeah, I think you did. I'd say you did. I'd say you did.
I didn't even realize that. Now that you mentioned it, I didn't even realize how it actually breaks down pretty well into a 4-act structure. Which, like, as you're reading it, you don't really think about. When I watch movies, I think about things like that. I never think about it when I'm reading a novel. But now that you mention it, it's just like, oh, whoa! I know exactly where that 4th act turn is.
I know. We could, on reprints, we can just slip in Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, Act 4.
We probably could, because, yeah, again, it's just kind of how I think about stories.
Well, I mean, I think it worked for this in a way that made a lot of sense, especially that we were building off of, this animated, short that started visually. I want to shift us ever so slightly to start to talk a little bit about some bits of the book itself, and some of the kind of themes and some of the elements, particularly in the way that there's a bunch of things in the book that, are very germane and very, very closely related to Star Wars, but because we are experiencing them in a different way, we all had to approach these various challenges of, well, what does that look like in this Star Wars story? And the first of those things is the idea of ghosts and spirits. Obviously, you say the word ghosts and Star Wars, and there are some very specific, images that pop to your mind of specific characters and moments and lines of dialogue, that everyone can imagine. And suffice to say, without going into it too deeply, because it's a very fun thing to explore, ghosts play a pretty pivotal role in Ronin. The concept of ghosts, the idea of ghosts. But they're maybe not exactly in the same way that you're used to. So, Emma, talk a little bit about like what the book's relationship with ghosts and spirits is, and where some of that inspiration came from. You sort of were starting to get at it with some of those details you were giving a minute ago.
Yeah, so that actually was when I was listing out things that first night about Star Wars. One of the first things I wrote down, even before I knew what I wanted to do with ghosts in Star Wars, was that I wanted to change the relationship this particular iteration of Star Wars had with ghosts. Because I think in Japanese folklore and also day-to-day Japanese stuff, like ghosts have a little more prevalence than they do in Western stories and so forth, because like ghosts are sort of uniformly scary for us. But a lot of Japanese folklore, ghosts can be very, very goofy. They can also be very, very scary, but they can be like very intimate, part of your family. And it's such a different experience of what a ghost means that, again, before I even knew what I was going to do, I knew like I wanted to have some of that in some way present in the text.
It makes a lot of sense. And this was maybe the first time, and Matt, I think you can speak to this a little bit. This is the first time we had one of those challenges where, we had to really think about like the terms we were using and how we were using terms that normally, you've got this, Star Wars has this amazing shorthand. If we do a Star Wars story and we use the word stormtrooper, we don't have to say anything else. Everyone knows what a stormtrooper is. Everyone knows bounty hunter is, Jedi, Sith, these many things. But with some of the terminology we're using around ghosts and spirits, it was the first time where we had to all sit around and be like, do we mean the same thing that we normally do? And if we don't, what's the term that we should use? And that was one of the things that I know that we talked about a bunch in some of the feedback, was just finding like exactly where the moment was to use the term that we are all familiar with, and maybe when it made more sense to use a term that might be a little bit more specific to this story, right?
Yeah, it was actually, it was really fascinating. I think it actually got me even more excited about this project, because typically with Star Wars, what we do with ghosts and spirits are, it's usually associated with the Force, and there's a pretty clear rule set around, what necessitates a ghost appearing and things like that. And being able to do that in this context was so freeing, because we were able to, kind of throw in the different folklore elements to a ghost, kind of more traditional ghost stories that we don't get in Star Wars. And it was such a cool way to tackle that. And it definitely led to other things where it was like we were looking at other terms that we would use in this. And I think I was probably a good sounding board for that, where like my nerd brain would start to trip up on something when I'm reading, and I'm like, that might be a stretch too far, because I can't make my brain comprehend that as anything but the thing that I know it to be. And I'm like, and I think other fans might be in that same boat. So there wasn't very many of those, but there was a few that I remember calling out that I'm like, we might need to change the terminology here or there just to get away from the pre-established connection that people already have after, 40 something years of Star Wars. And it was just like, it was so fun to be that kind of sounding board and like, start to understand even like my own shortcomings when it comes to Star Wars and the box that I put it in.
Yeah, my very first read of Emma's manuscript, before anyone else saw it, when I was the only one in the world who had it, my very first read had a whole bunch of notes that were just like, wait, that's not what that is. And then me coming back to that note and being like, nope, it can be that in this one. Like having to essentially unlearn like a bunch of stuff, or not unlearn it, but kind of, put it to the side for a second and figure out whether or not it was something that could be recontextualized or not. Emma, was there anything in developing the story, were there any elements or terms where you were the first person who had to negotiate that challenge? So were there any things that came up to you in the process, the writing process, when you were like, oh, I'm having a hard time bridging that gap, or, oh, I think I can actually figure out a way to do this? Was there anything that you can recall?
It feels like a nebulous question, so I'm not really sure. Like writing is always a process of like, I have made a problem for myself. How do I fix it?
Yes.
And I certainly, every once in a while would go running to Wikipedia and be like, tell me about birds in Star Wars.
This is the eternal role of the editor, by the way, to ask a writer nebulous questions that then they're like, I don't know, it's a nebulous question. Why are you asking that? It's the eternal role between an editor and an author. This actually, talking about ghosts, talking about spirits, talking about all these kind of weird secret things, actually is a good time to talk about. This is a book that is just a novel full of secrets. Like the entire book is a secret. The characters' journeys to what we're trying to figure out is kind of a secret. Who our main character is a secret. There's a thing there, people have varying sobriquets and names and, different names that are kind of, everything's a secret in this book. And secrets are super fun. We all love secrets. But secrets offer a very specific narrative challenge because you can't just have a book of secrets, because if you have a book completely with secrets, there's no story for anyone to follow. So Emma, what was it like building a narrative basically around everything being a secret to everyone?
So this is actually a problem I have. I often do this to myself. Often in the stories I write, people are lying to each other, not maliciously, often neurotically. And in this one, I would say for the most part, everyone's lying neurotically. But yeah, so I've had a lot of my writing journey has been figuring out, well, how can you have a secret and still have a story? And there's this shorthand that I think is Hitchcockian, which is like, show them the bomb. And the thing that you learn when you think and write like this is that telling somebody one feature of the bomb tells them very little, but it allows them to speculate a lot. So this is a great opportunity, because as soon as you see our Ronin, our Sith man, you go, well, what does that mean? And every time you learn one more feature about him, you're like, well, why is he doing that? And it's just, you give a concrete piece of information, but there's so much absent after that one concrete piece of information that it was basically like drip feeding the truth along the entirety, because you never have to obscure the truth. You just have to like give tiny bits of it here and there.
And something else that you chose to do, which is one of my favorite things in stories. And so when you started to do this, I was just like so giddy, is I love when an author in a story takes information and decides like, well, the reader gets this information, but the characters don't have that information. And these characters get this information, and you basically dole out the truth and the info to a bunch of different places, including the reader. And then the course of the story is all of that information passing through the other entities, some of it getting telephoned or getting, recontextualized. But I love the fact that you embraced that to like a ridiculous degree, but entirely in service to the narrative that we were building, which I think was perfect, especially given the fact that we have a main character who's just like pathologically doesn't want to tell anyone about himself. So of course you as the reader are going to know some things about this character that other people in the book don't know about until maybe never. Depends. You'll have to read and find out. But I love that so much.
I have to admit that I had to like restrain myself from going back to the original outline as like a cheat sheet, because every time I saw you setting something up, I was like, oh, she's setting something up? And I couldn't remember because I'd read the outline so long ago that I couldn't remember the details. And I'm like, no, I need to see this through to the end to make sure it works. But I was so intrigued by the mysteries that you were setting up that like it was so hard to like basically knowing that I had the answers in a much easier to get to form. It was so hard to restrain myself and be like, nope, you have to read it. You have to get there. You have to earn this. And I'm so glad I did. Actually probably made the story way better than if I just cheated.
I did the same thing. And then I remember, in part because too, I just wanted to be like, is this landing? Are the parts that were in the outline, like, is this all working right? I didn't want to bias myself. But then I went back to the outline. I was just like, I can't wait, this was in the outline? And I went back, I was like, yeah, it was in the outline. I can't believe that was like, just because it was astounding and interesting. I had a follow-up question. Now I've forgotten it. Because obviously the animated short is so visual and obviously so intense with the visuals, and that lent itself to one of my favorite packages of a book ever. Kotaro Chiba is the artist who did the front cover of our book and just could not have done a better job with the Ronin and his whole thing. Do either of you have a favorite small detail about the Ronin that is revealed in the Duel from like an aesthetic perspective that was like the most interesting thing you learned about sort of him as a person just from looking at him, and just from seeing him?
I mean, I know we're all
Go
going
ahead,
to talk about his lightsabers, which are just, what are you doing, my guy? What's with this?
We are going to talk about that in a second, yes.
Yeah, but personally, I think my favorite might actually be the studio note that his jaw thing is a prosthetic.
That was going to be my thing too.
Yeah, like, oh, cool, me too, dude. I've got prosthetic hips. I loved that so much.
Yes, that was great. And by the way, for folks who are going to read the book, that gets explained and evolved on a bit, so you had to learn more about that. I think the detail that he is just outright wearing the lightsabers, just like not even trying to hide it, is pretty awesome. Like, for a person who's like, I do not wish to be perceived, I wish to just be alone with my droid friend and wander the countryside, like, but also I'm like wearing the equivalent of like a flashing caution light like on my sash at all times. What is up with that? That is,
it's a good way to keep people away.
It is.
Yeah, that's why I had him called out on it real early on.
Be like, sir, you're just like wearing the weapons. You're not even trying. But let's talk about the lightsaber. Let's talk about the lightsaber, because I think, Emma, I would love for you to tell this mini story because it led to one of the funnier moments in the development of this book, which is, so as we all see from the trailer to Visions, like I think maybe the first image in the first trailer for Visions to, the Duel itself, is that he does not, his lightsaber does not seem to function in the way that, or at least he doesn't use it in the way that we've classically seen lightsabers, which is he pulls it out of a scabbard. And so that's obviously asks a million questions and is super cool. But Emma, what did we learn during the development of this book that we did not actually know when we started and required us to dive back into the story to make some adjustments fairly late in the game, I might add, though with plenty of time to actually do it? What did we learn?
So this actually came in two bursts. The first thing we learned, this was after I think I had finished the first draft, and we got another version, a more polished version of the Duel to watch. And this is the one where they add the music. So I'm sitting there absolutely enthralled, and I watched the in full the first time, and then I watch it in a much slower beat the next time. So I'm like making little notes about like, oh, this changed about the fight. Oh, this detail was made clear. And then at the end, it becomes clear that yes, he does have two lightsabers, but the second lightsaber is not the other sword on his sash, which I had remembered thinking, it's weird that she doesn't notice he's got two hilts. Why didn't she think about that? And it's because the other hilt is not a lightsaber. The other lightsaber is the scabbard. And I just lost my little mind. Like, oh my God, this is actually kind of a problem for me because, pretty early on, there's sort of a game of musical chairs with who has what lightsaber. And, it just involved so many little edits here and there. And then we got another studio note very, very late that the reason he has the scabbard is because his proper lightsaber, the one he's usually using, doesn't turn off.
It's broken.
It's broken. Specifically, it's not, it doesn't turn off because he did that on purpose. It doesn't turn off because something's wrong with it. And they didn't tell us what, so we had to figure that out. But just sitting there, and I'm thinking, oh my God, this man has so many deep psychological issues. And it fit perfectly with everything that had already been written about him. And we pitched a couple ideas to Matt in the story group, and they selected one, and we went with that. But oh my goodness. And it was so funny because literally, like within a few weeks, someone on Twitter is joking about, haha, maybe he needs the scabbard because the lightsaber doesn't turn off. Like,
Nailed it.
I can't tell you that you're right.
Nailed it. 1,000 fake internet points to you,
I
person on
love
Twitter.
that because there were so many people when the initial teaser came out. There were so many people going like, "Oh, that doesn't make sense. That there's no way that makes sense." And I knew at that point because it was like right around the time that we got this information from the studio that like, no, it totally makes sense, and it actually makes a lot of character sense too.
Mhm.
I couldn't wait for people to figure it out. And then I saw that joke tweet, and I was just like, "Well, cat's out of the bag."
Yes.
Gosh.
But
Yeah.
that was another great moment where, you know, we got this note. It was a little late. We had to furiously rush through and fix a bunch of things in the manuscript, which didn't account for that. But it was another moment where we got to say, oh, it was just another one of those moments that asked a million questions. And so we were able to say, oh, okay, well, we're going to take this and run with it story-wise. And we were able to do that, again, thanks to the generosity of the studio, which was, we turned this fun little challenge into this extra fun opportunity to build out for both the Ronin character and actually another character who maybe gets their hands on said lightsaber for our moment, gets a moment to kind of interact with this situation and kind of reconcile with it, and actually reveals even more about what's going on in the wider world, which was super cool. But I just loved it. I love that it was just this great extra detail. By the way, we've mentioned a few times how, you know, obviously working on the book throughout the development while Visions and the Duel was in progress. If you go, obviously, if you haven't watched the Duel, I can't imagine you're watching this, but if you haven't, you should go watch it. It's on Disney Plus right now. It's phenomenal. You absolutely should watch it. But the other thing that you should watch is there are also behind the scenes featurettes for every single one of the animated shorts, including the Duel. So if you go into Disney Plus and go into Visions, you can find them. And there are these little behind the scenes featurettes with interviews with the studios. And they do show off in the Duel episode a few more bits of concept art. I think you see a few bits of like very early animatic. So if you want a little bit more of a sense of like what kinds of like in progress animation were we looking at on our way to seeing the final, if you watch that, you'll actually get a little bit of a sense of some of the stuff that Emma was using as we were progressing through the story. And also those things are really amazing. So check them out anyway. Okay. I have held off long enough in asking about this. So we are now going to talk about some plot stuff. Like I said, early plot stuff that was released in the 5-chapter excerpt released last week or a little over a week ago. But we need to talk about the Sith Bandit, whom we will discover in this book has a name. And she has a name, and so we are going to use it. Her name is Koru. And from what we learn in the early part of the book is that her story does not end at the end of the duel, despite the fact that it appears that her story has come to a rather abrupt end. So let's talk about this, Emma. Why did you decide to, let's say, bring her back? And how did you end up developing her story, again, given that it appeared to terminate at the conclusion of the duel?
So I'm wearing the Kodu merch. There's a Kodu shirt. If you love her, please join me. She's so this is a dual thing because one was like that early note I had made to myself about like, oh, I want to do something with ghosts. And the second thing was, I think an inciting event of a book benefits a lot from doing a lot of the legwork for setting up the rest of it. And it just made so much sense to me to use every part of it for the ongoing thing. And it was also just instantly like putting those two things together. Oh my God, this is what makes this Wednesday. The dead are coming back. The problem's not over. And so, yeah, and it's just like there's something about the place where she's killed. It's so reminiscent of a temple. Specifically, it's got like Buddhist temple vibes. where you have like that idol who seems sort of like a bodhisattva. And I've heard people go like, it looks like George, and I've been like, I thought it was Obi-Wan. Yeah, so there's something so eerie about that, and it just seemed really appropriate for this to occur. And so like there's also this point in my notes where I suddenly have in all capitalizations, oh my god, can I resurrect the Sith lady? It all spiraled out of that because I was like, oh yeah, no, this makes perfect sense. This is a great way to once again be really leaning very hard on using the duel as like the fodder from which everything else is built. And also there's a lot of different narrative traditions really like the revenge stories, but there's like a whole subgenre of Japanese cinema that's about revenge. And so having her be in that mode was very interesting to me because I have a lot of problems with that kind of story if it's not done with a lot of thought. So yeah, I really enjoyed her. She's very, very fun for me. I also really like Scary Sith Ladies. Anyone who's seen me on Twitter has seen me like having like the vapors about Asajj Ventress or the second sister in Jedi Fallen Order. That's just where I am all day. Like I can't let her go. Look at her character design. It's so good.
It's phenomenal.
So, yeah.
And yeah, it's such a, when we knew that was going to now be able to happen, and we're going to be able to build this story that develops and tells her tale as much as it tells the Ronins. It just opened up so many extra possibilities. I'm like almost shaking with anticipation for people to find out exactly what is going on and why it is going on and everything about her journey. It's great. So I want to, like, as we're sort of heading towards our wrap up a little bit, we're not obviously going to dive too much further into the actual like plot of the book, because again, we want people to discover it. It is this amazing, unique journey that whether or not this is your first Star Wars story or your 200th Star Wars story, that you are going to go on a journey you've never been on before. And we want to preserve that as much as possible for everyone. But I want to talk about a character that we met in the excerpt. You meet very early in the book, basically right after the Ronin and his droid leave the town. The first person they wander into is a character that we meet who becomes known as the Traveler. They're a musician, a bit of a storyteller, and they happen to have kind of a keen interest in the Ronin character. So can you give people just a little bit more info exactly on kind of the idea behind the Traveler character, their kind of unique design, and a bit of, I guess I'll call it costuming, even if that's maybe not exactly spot on, just to tease a little bit more about how that character interacts with the Ronin.
Yes. So there's actually like two notes here to look for. One is that one of the folklore things I listed out for myself in terms of like, ooh, I want to like see what that looks like in Star Wars. One of the ones that made it very strongly into the story was Kitsune, because I think there's a lot of fun with the way fox spirits show up in Japanese folklore, because they're also present in Korean and Chinese folklore, but as the Hulijing and as the Gumiho, they are like purely wicked almost entirely. Like they're almost always bad news, very dangerous. This is no good. You don't want to have anything to do with that. But when you get into Japanese folklore, there is a lot more ambiguity surrounding exactly what a kitsune means. Sometimes they will possess a person and drive them insane, and that's not an act of goodwill. But simultaneously, there is Inari, who's a Shinto kami, a Shinto deity, who is a fox and a kitsune and associated with harvest and good fortune. So there's just, and sometimes the tricks are just playful. They're not like cruel or malicious. And just having that character in the story, like having a trickster around is always fun, because you never quite know what to think about them. But the other thing that I think some readers might pick up on, and I, for the life of me, can't remember the name. There's a particular kind of mendicant monk who made their living traveling and playing the flute. And they had these hats that were kind of like baskets over their heads. And they have an interesting role in both history and in Jidaigeki stories that's also present in The Traveler. And I will not say more because that's kind of a spoiler, but look that up if you're interested.
There's a reason that I have asked you about, obviously we've talked a lot about the Ronin, that I asked you about the Sith Bandit, Koru, and I asked you about the Traveler. And that's because I wanted to talk to you about names and identities, because names and identities are at the core of this story. There are so many characters who have multiple names, who have sobriquets, who have sort of titles, who go by one name or are referred to by a different character as another name, etc. And the names and identities of these characters are so central to actually moving the story forward, not just like adding depth to the characters, but actually moving our narrative forward. So tell me what was so important about centering the identities across the board in this story, and how much that meant to you in building out Ronin.
So this is interesting because I think it kind of comes from two places. And one of them is that the studio directive really early on was like, he's just the Ronin. He doesn't have a name. So I think pretty early we were like, all right, so no name then. And I think I maybe would have had the freedom to put his name in the text, but that just didn't feel right. But consequently, names became hyper important in the narrative, and names are identity. So that was just, it naturally became a theme because that was a feature of him. And therefore, every instance of a character having a name or not having a name and their relationship with that is a reflection on your central figure and everything he's going through. And I think this also just comes from being asked to write a Japanese Star Wars is interesting when you are a fourth generation diasporic mixed Japanese person. Like, I'm not just Japanese, I'm also queer, I am chronically ill, and I've had a lot of anxiety about how connected I am to Japanese culture and Japanese heritage. And for a very long time, I very purposefully disenfranchised myself from telling Japanese stories because it didn't feel appropriate. But I had this fortune of encountering a short comic, I think it's called Folding Kimono by Gem Yoshioka. And it's about sort of crossing that bridge and navigating those waters between yourself and the culture from which you are diasporic. And it was really beneficial to me to read that because it was about how, of course, you aren't Japanese, you are a Japanese person or a person of Japanese heritage in another place. And so that was a lot of what I was bringing to this project of like interpreting my relationship to that background, and also approaching it from a place of a lot of love and yearning and a desire to like be as giving as possible as I'm reaching. And part of that involved also like trying not to be anxious about putting things in about queer people or about chronically ill people, which again, both of which I am. And I remember having this deep anxiety about like, they hired me to be a person of Japanese descent. They did not hire me to be a queer person. Am I going to get away with any of this? And I have to thank you because I never got a no. I only got support and encouragement and like, yeah, cool, like figure it out. And a lot of trust, I think, was involved in that. And I was also very grateful for that. And so, yeah, no, I was able to write a story that was for me deeply personal in a lot of ways, while also doing my best to honor all the other features of the project. And yeah, so identity was important because it was just a core theme from the beginning, and just the nature of who I am and my relationship to what the project is in the grand tapestry of history.
Well, I think we're so glad that you did that because, to be quite honest, the best stories, particularly the best Star Wars stories, they come when they're also deeply personal stories to the people making them. That they just do. It's just functionally true about storytelling, and Star Wars is no different than that. So I'm glad that you brought all of that to the story and to all the characters. I mean, there is a pretty wide array of characters you're going to meet in this book. We've talked about like 3 of them, and there is a pretty wide array, and they form this just incredible tapestry of characters who are ridiculous and amazing. And so we only have a couple minutes left, and so I think kind of wrapping up a bit on characters and on Ronin overall makes sense. And I'm actually going to allow either of you, with a couple of exceptions. I can't tell you which the exceptions are, so I'm trusting the 2 of you to, read through the Force with me. Do you have a favorite character in this book? And you can even mention 1 or 2 of the characters who people haven't met yet. You're not allowed to choose B5, Hatroid, because obviously he's the correct answer, and that would make this a very boring question. But do you have a favorite character in the book?
I mean, I definitely do.
Yeah.
Okay.
I really loved Ekia, and I don't want to get too deep into who she is, but she's the pilot of the Poor Crow. So I think she basically comes into the story immediately after the excerpt that's out online. So we were very close to introducing her, but
yes,
didn't make it out there. But I mean, she's a pilot, which obviously makes her cool. She's got bright tattoos, and just as a tattooed person, I have to feel the need to like support other people like me. But really what it was is kind of her dialogue and the way that, she brings a lot of the humor to the story for me. And when you were speaking about how different characters are identified in different ways, I love that the way that she refers to the Ronin is just as grim. And it's like, that is just the perfect way to define that guy. And just like basically just calling him grim is like, it's great. And that's exactly the sort of character that I'm always drawn to. So yeah, I mean, as soon as I loved the story from page 1, but as soon as that character entered into it, I was like really leaning in.
That was going to be my pick too. She brings, she brings a dimension to the story that up until the point we meet that character, we have not yet seen. And it's a dimension that is about, what is a quote unquote normal person or regular person in this galaxy, someone who's not necessarily, wearing lightsabers on their sash. Well, I'll go that far. What do they think about living in a galaxy where these things exist, and how do they relate to that? And she brings that. She's fantastic. Emma, I realize asking you to pick a favorite character is a challenge, so we won't hold you to this, but do you have one?
I'm thrilled because Ekia is the character I wrote for the me who first fell in love with Star Wars. She's the character I wish I had grown up with. So, like, there's a part of me for whom absolutely she's my favorite character. But the characters I wrote for the person I am now are Chie, who you are going to meet around the same time as Ekia, and the Traveler. Like, they're both the kinds of characters I really gravitate toward these days in different ways. So yeah, enjoy.
That's great. So we're going to wrap up here with this one more question. It's a very broad, very open-ended question, but it made perfect sense, which is, what are you most excited about for people to discover with Ronin in at least, East Coast US in 3 hours when the book comes out at midnight, available ebook, audio, and hardcover. So is there anything most excited for people to discover? Again, you can't say Hatroid, can't say B5 because he's the correct answer.
I hope it gives you a new way to interpret your relationship with Star Wars. That's certainly what it was for me. It's just such an exciting way to like reconnect with different features of this narrative DNA, and because it's reflection upon reflection upon reflection, right? So everything in it, and my favorite thing has been people going like, "Oh, was this a reference to that?" And me going, "No," but it could be.
I did that.
Because
That was
that's
me.
just oh, you're not the only one. It's just there's such a richness in Star Wars because of its nature as like the Shakespearean melodrama that when you are right in that vein, you inevitably have that crossover. And so I'm really excited for people to enjoy that.
I have a pretty similar answer, I guess. And it's really just with Visions as a whole. I love that fans kind of get to see really all of the possibilities that Star Wars can present. It's such just a rich world, and when creators are allowed to kind of push it and make it their own, it can go in some really cool and interesting directions, as we see very clearly with Ronin. It is, you know, it's funny because it's part of my job to be like the continuity person. And I love telling stories that are directly tied into other stories that we're doing. But, you know, with Visions and this book in particular, it's kind of allowed me to kind of get out of that box and really see the kind of full expanse of just the creativity behind a world like Star Wars. So I hope fans kind of come out of it with a similar feeling as I did, which is sort of almost like an enlightenment. And I also wouldn't hate it if Ronin encouraged more people to dig into kind of classic samurai cinema, because it's awesome and everybody should watch it.
It absolutely is, and you should.
Watch parties.
Yes, exactly. Watch parties, read parties. I think the thing that I'm really so excited about is, you know, for people who spend so much time watching, reading, playing, drawing, experiencing Star Wars in so many different ways, you've got so many stories that you've consumed that over time, when a new story comes out, maybe you can't guess exactly where it's going, but you kind of have this sense because you're like, oh, well, you know, these are the repeating themes, or this character, or I know eventually this character ends up here and we're in between. And with this story, you can't do that. And you can't do that in the best possible way, because this story rewards your trust, rewards you just going on the journey with it. It rewards you in letting go of the idea that you can kind of guess where it's going. And I'm not going to say anything more, except that the cool thing too about Ronin is when you get to that last page and you read that last page, you're going to turn the book back to page 1 and you're going to start over, because now you know some things that you didn't know at page 1. And it might make your second read or your second listen a little bit different than the first one. But I can't tell you anything more about it, or else that would sort of ruin the magic. So with that, we are going to wrap things up. We want to thank everyone for hanging out. Thank you guys for hanging out in the chat all evening. Thank you to all our friends who showed up. Thank you to Emma and Matt. It's great to hang out with you as always. And thank you to Nerdist, and thank you to Mysterious Galaxy. Reminder, if you want to pick up a signed copy of the book, either for yourself or looking for gifts for people, check the link in the description. There should be information there. And the book, if you're watching this right now, the book comes out in 3 hours. If you're watching this in the future, it's already out, available in print, available at ebook, available as an audiobook. Joel De La Fuente is the narrator. It is phenomenal. It's fantastic, as all the audiobooks are. So, you know, happy reading. We hope you love the book. Emma poured everything into it, and it's a one-of-a-kind Star Wars story that we can't wait for you all to read. So, yeah, thanks, everybody, and may the Force be with you.